Hello, good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's the Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where we shall be taking a look at the important articles which have appeared in today's newspaper, that is 17th of September 2023. And today we shall be analyzing the articles which have appeared in the Bangalore edition of the newspaper. So let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold a discussion for. But before that, let me urge you to please go on our Telegram channel, and after the analysis, kindly take up the quiz for the multiple choice questions and try to assess your level of understanding, and also try to understand the type of questions which can be framed from these particular topics, particularly keeping prelims perspective in mind. Having said that, let us take a look at the topics that we are going to discuss today. So today in total we are going to have a discussion for 7 topics. Out of those, the 3 topics we are going to discuss in detail for an analytical purpose for the mains perspective. So that is going to be India, Middle East, EU corridor. So that has been approached in this particular edition twice. So it has appeared in page 8 as well as in page 13. So that is relevant for your GS paper 3. Here we shall be discussing what this corridor is about, even though this has been discussed prior as well. So here we are going to try to discuss it in very brief, in a kind of a gist manner. That is, what are the parts of this corridor? Why is it that this corridor is important or relevant for India? And what are the various hurdles and obstacles which still remain in the way? Then what is driving the Global Biofuel Alliance? That has appeared in page 13. That is again going to be relevant for your GS paper 3. Then winds of change in the global governance, and here we are going to talk about the emergence of the global south and the need for the emergence of the global south when it comes to multilateralism, when it comes to driving the issues for global governance. We are also going to analyze what do we understand when we talk about global south. What is the brand line which actually distinguishes the global north and global south? That is again going to be relevant for your GS paper 3 as well as in GS paper 2 as well. You will find the relevance of this. So GS paper 3 as well as GS 2. Now, there are certain topics that we are going to discuss for the prelims perspectives. That is AI cameras to curb poaching. So that has been put into experimental phase in various different regions in Madhya Pradesh, and that is sought to curb the various different issues of poaching which are emerging. Over 75% of European bumblebee population is threatened. That has appeared in page 12. This is again going to be relevant for your prelims perspective, that how is it going to impact the overall biodiversity and ecosystem. Then Nikshay Poshan Yojana, which is a part for treatment and getting rid of the disease of TB across the entirety of the population of the country. So here, with the help of this article, we shall be trying to understand what is that Nikshay Poshan Yojana, what do we understand by Nikshay Mitras. Then songbirds, there has been a finding which relates the ability of the songbirds to mimic the various sounds with their brain size. So these are the various topics that we are going to hold a discussion for today. So straightforward, let us go into the first topic. So the first topic is about India, Middle East, EU corridor to have multiple routes, but hurdles remain. Now this particular corridor, which is also in certain areas touted as the boat and the rail initiative, is touted as an alternative for the Belt and Road Initiative project, which had been initiated by China for an economic transit as well as the trade routes to be established between Asia and Europe. But then the problem with the Chinese initiative has been the predatory economics that they have followed, and the diplomacy has also followed along with that, whereby they particularly tend to target the economically vulnerable countries, and their economies particularly are also kept vulnerable furthermore with the Chinese loans coming in, and many of these countries have faced the issue of default going ahead in the long run. So there are the alternatives, and the entire project is sought to be as an alternate option for that Belt and Road Initiative. Now this was finalized, and in fact the negotiations, the talks for this had been going on for some time since the past year, but it was finalized on the moment of G20 presidentship of India. Now here which are the important members that is going to be relevant for your prelims perspective. So other than the co-chairs, that is India and the US, the signatories of this initiative include Saudi Arabia, UAE, European Union, Greece, Italy, France, and Germany. These are the various different members who are involved in this. Now, here, one has to understand what this entire project is about, what this entire corridor is about. So this corridor is divided into two components. One is the East Corridor, as you refer to it. One is the East Corridor and other is the Northern Corridor. Now, both of them provide connectivity in different areas. For example, here if you take an overarching view and an overall view of what this project is about, so it talks about providing a sea route connectivity between India and Middle East first, and it can have connectivity through the UAE, it can have connectivity through other areas of the Gulf nations, and eventually the transit will be sought through the region of Saudi Arabia and through the, various countries. It will reach the Haifa port in Israel, and that forms the Eastern Corridor. Now, after that, again, the sea transit and the sea route shall be followed across the Mediterranean, and you will have landing ports at Marseille in France, in Italy, Messina port in Italy, as well as the Piraeus port in Greece. So these are going to be the various different components of the entire corridor system. So the Northern Corridor and the East Corridor, what they are, again relevant for your examination. But here, when we talk about this corridor in slightly greater detail, so in this part, if you analyze what the article today has signified is the fact that many of these transit routes, they offer multiple different options. Options to move goods and services from one particular portion of the world to the other portion, but that route is still not decided. There are various different areas where there is no such infrastructure connectivity which is provided. Now, please understand that this connectivity is sought to be provided between the sea route and the rail route. These are the only two. That is why many of the geostrategists have cited it or basically termed it as the Boat and Rail Initiative, just as an acronym which is very similar to the Belt and Road Initiative. That is why Boat and Rail Initiative is being touted here. That is, through the sea routes, you move it through the shipments, and then through the land areas, you move it through the railway lines. But as you can see, in many of the regions of the Gulf, you don't have the establishment of that railway line, which has been done till now. And many of these areas, including the region in Saudi Arabia, including furthermore in the region of Jordan, now in many of these areas, there is a missing link. So there needs to be an establishment of these greenfield projects for many kilometers, multiple kilometers, that needs to be done. That is why Saudi Arabia becomes a very important key member in this entire initiative in ensuring the efficacy of movement from one region to another. But now, let us come to the analysis of it. What are the opportunities that this corridor, that this initiative holds? First of all, it will bring about an increased transit efficiency. When we talk about increased transit efficiency, that means basically the goods can be moved from Europe to Asia at a rate which is 40% faster. Think about it, that the amount of time which will be saved will be very significant. And here also you can think about the perspective which was recently highlighted after the finalization of the corridor. There was a perspective provided by the very acclaimed historian William Dalrymple. And William Dalrymple in fact argued that, look, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Silk Route Initiative, all of that being touted by China, these are all 19th century and the 20th century connotations which have come into play. But if you take a look into the history, if you take a historical view of how the trade relations have happened across these areas, there have been various evidences to indicate that this is the trade route through the Red Sea, obviously, coming into India. That is the trade route that the Europeans and the Eurasian region has followed in order to reach India and in order to carry out trade with India, as has been indicated by the various scriptures which are available from the time of the ancient Roman Empire itself. In fact, the records by Pliny the Senior does also indicate the amount of goods, the type of goods which are being transported to India from the Roman ports, coming over to Egypt, after moving through the Egypt and again coming over through the Red Sea, and eventually being able to reach India. So there is the geographical factor also involved here, which has always historically promoted trade between these two parts of the world. Now, which geographical factors are we talking about? So for a very brief moment, I will take you to that historical perspective, because that is also important to understand, so as to understand whether this particular trade route is going to be organically developed, in the sense, does it make an absolute economic value, or is it something where the countries are becoming over ambitious? Now, when you take a look back at history, obviously at that point of time, the ships did not have the diesel powered engines and the various nuclear powered engines that you have now in the case of the various different ships. At that point of time, the ships would travel with the help of the wind system, the sails that were attached in the ships, and they would use those sails and the winds prevalent to travel through and forth. Now, when we talk about reaching India, during the months of May, June, July, August, September, if you take a look at the direction of the wind movement in the region of the northern Indian Ocean, that direction of wind movement is southwest to northeast, what we also refer to as the southwest monsoon. So historically, the traders would take the help and advantage of these winds to reach the Indian coastline. But then again, come the winter months, or during the months of November, December, January and so on, the direction of the winds in the northern Indian Ocean would actually reverse. The direction of the winds would be northeast to southwest. And that would enable the traders to sail back away from India, carrying all the goods that they could. And that is why historical evidences have indicated the existence of various different ports across the western coastline of India in majority, with which the Romans would carry on their trade. In fact, recent excavations in the region of Egypt has also indicated, and archaeological excavations have indicated, the presence of certain goods which have an Indian origin associated with them. For example, you have the statue of Bodhisattva, you have the statue of few of the Indian gods and goddesses which have been excavated in the region of Egypt dating back almost 2000 years. So if the trade would not have been carried out that early, then it doesn't make sense why and how these goods could have reached that region of Africa. So that basically signifies, and it also in a way demarcates the possibility that yes, indeed there has been a historical connect which India, Middle East and the European nations along with United States, they are trying to cement it further in order to provide an alternative to the predatory economics indicated by China. So that is the historical background that you should be aware of. Now, coming back to the opportunities and the benefits associated. Reduced cost. Now, obviously, if any transportation mechanism is much more efficient and involves significant amount of transit through the shipping lanes. Now, shipping lanes are always going to be cheaper in comparison. So that reduced cost is associated. So that will make the goods much more attractive, and that will cater to the demand which is present generally in the region of India as well, in the region of Europe as well. That is why many of the European countries, in fact, were much more keen on joining this initiative as compared to how the amount of keenness indicated by India and Middle East. In fact, when you talk about this G20 presidentship, it was on the sidelines of this G20 presidentship when Italy informally communicated to China that they are actually seeking an exit from the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, and they are seeking to be a part of this particular corridor. Now, there will also be a reduced level of greenhouse gas emissions because majority of the transit again by ship or the boat and rail. It is the road transportation which is responsible for maximum amount of emission. So this will also help in combating climate change, right? So combating climate change. It will bring about significant amount of generation of jobs, because whenever there is an increase in the total amount of trade carried out, there is a positive correlation in between the trade volume and the jobs which are generated in all the participating countries in the midway. then integration of Asia, Europe and Middle East will eventually be possible. And India has been trying quite significantly to get the access to this connectivity. And this has been hampered by the presence of a hostile neighbor across our western border, that is Pakistan. Now, the relationship between India and Pakistan is topsy-turvy at level best, and trade relationships are absolutely almost absent or almost negligible. In fact, the entirety of the region of South Asia is one of the least connected regions across the entirety of the world when you consider the geopolitics of it. So that means the economic potential is not always realized. That is why India had been seeking an alternative in the form of the north-south corridor through the Chabahar port. Now, that has not shown much of a potential and not much of a development or progress in the recent times. Again, there has been a reinvigoration in that, but again, the benefit out of it is slightly limited, because all the countries in Central Asia which are sought to be connected by the north-south corridor through the Chabahar port in Iran, now most of those economies are not doing particularly well. But when it comes to access to Europe, India has got significant scope. And when we talk about the EU-India Free Trade Agreement deal, which is being finalized and which is being negotiated, the establishment of this transit route will further aid the movement of goods and will further increase our export capability as well. Then infrastructure development is also sought to happen. For example, electricity cables through these areas, through the and along the railway lines, along with the digital connectivity is to be provided. Now, this will allow the trade of services as well. Service sector is the one of keen interest when it comes to India. So that is the benefit that India sees. But along with that, this corridor is also specific in the sense that it seeks to provide a separate pipeline for provision of cleaner and green hydrogen from one area to another. So that also provides a pipeline for hydrogen supply, which is going to be beneficial in the long run. So this will provide clean energy. Availability, accessibility and affordability of clean energy is going to be the challenge of the future, and that is something that it is going to provide. But then in this entire corridor and the implementation of project, there are certain hurdles and challenges that has been indicated by the article as well, that these all countries have to be wary about. So first of all, there still is a large missing link in the construction areas in the various different regions which still need to be connected. Then standardization of transportation medium needs to be achieved. What do we mean by that? So when we talk about a transit from all the way from India all the way to the region of Europe, you have to understand that how is it that the goods are transported. The goods are basically transported in containers through the rail route, then those containers are shipped or moved into the ships, and those ships then end up moving. Now, let's suppose a good is being transported from India, somewhere northern part of India, to the western port and the coastline where you have the Mundra, the Kandla port or the JNPT in Mumbai. Now, there the containers would travel through Indian railways, and then again the same containers would be shipped into the region of Middle East and again through railways. Now, what is required to be implemented here is that the railway transportation, when it comes to the gauge length, that is the distance between the rail lines that are present, the types of engines which drive these trains, all of them have to be standardized across this entirety of the connectivity line in order to ensure a seamless and efficient movement. Otherwise, think about it, if the containers, let's suppose, which are used in Indian railways, those containers are not suitable to be implemented in the Middle Eastern region or in the European region, then the entire project will be simply an exercise in futility. So that is why you need a standardization of transport medium, which is very difficult to achieve, because all of these countries will develop their transportation, will develop their infrastructure, keeping their own needs in mind. Now, eventually, even though it is touted as an alternative to China, but the sad reality of the present geopolitical world is that you cannot choose to ignore China. Why is that? Now, when you talk about the landing port in Greece, now that is owned by the Chinese organization. When you talk about the missing link being constructed in Saudi Arabia, Now, for that infrastructure project, it is the Chinese companies which are close to being emerging as the bidders, the winning bidders for the completion of the infrastructure project. So in all of this project, for infrastructure development, for the port handling, etc., Chinese companies are predominant. It is only in the Haifa port in Israel where India has a ownership through the Adani ports, obviously. Now that brings about increased geopolitical tensions. Now, another important hurdle or challenge that needs to be tackled is increased handling charges. Now, what do we mean by handling charges? Handling charges here refer to the charges which are incurred while you transit a particular good, let's suppose from one area to another. How do you move those goods from the railways to the ships, etc. So in this particular project, here if you analyze, again if I take you back to this image, think about it, that from the port cities of India, the goods have to be moved from rail line to the ships. Again from here, it has to be moved from ship back to the rail line. Again from here, back from rail line to the ships again. And for accessibility through the and into the European nations, again, that transitioning has to happen. So that means every time that you offload and onload any particular container from the rail to the ship, from the ship to the rail and vice versa, it will increase your insurance cost, it will increase your overall handling charges. So that has the potential to make the process expensive. Okay. Now, the another sticking point here, which many of the countries have tried to overlook, is the ties between Israel and Gulf members, because Israel is also an important part of this corridor, because the end point from the region of Mediterranean is the Haifa port in Israel. Now, Israel and the Gulf nations, including Saudi Arabia, they don't share the best of their relationships. In fact, Israel and Saudi Arabia, they still don't have the establishment of a normalized diplomatic relationships out there because of Saudi's support to the Palestinian cause and so on. So because of these various causes, Israel and the Gulf countries, they always again have a topsy-turvy relationship. Now, if that relationship goes sour at any point of time, the entire project can be put in jeopardy. Now here, one of the important key points in this particular corridor is the active participation that US has sought and that US is bringing about. Now, there is a reason why US is suddenly showing significant amount of interest in the infrastructure projects in the region of Asia, Middle East and Europe. And that is to counter the Chinese influence. And also the reality of the matter is that countries such as UAE, countries such as Saudi Arabia, they have started taking a look at their existing relationships with US, and they have started examining the fact that can we replace the relationship that we have with United States with the relationship with China, because believe it or not, the geographical realities of the region indicate that proximity of China in the region and the ever-looming large presence of China in the region, that brings about a greater involvement of that country in this particular area, and Chinese investments are flooding the region of the Middle East. So in order to counter that, US has sought to bring about investment and thereby maintain its influence in this area. Now, this can be counterproductive as well in the long run, because at the end of the day, after the end of, let's suppose, a long time interval, maybe US will seek something in return, and maybe these countries will not favor that. But that is a challenge for the future. That is not something that you have to seek out today. In fact, there is a scheduled meeting in very recent or near future where the modalities, the time frame, etc. needs to be finalized. You have to understand that other major challenge is the realization of this project. Many of the projects on a similar scale have been conceptualized, have been thought about, but they have not been brought on paper. So that is an issue. That is why while this project was being launched, while this corridor was being launched, one of the very interesting statements, if you have if you would have heard that press statement, one of the most interesting statements was made by the French president. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron actually made the statement that, look, all the things that you guys are talking about, all of that is very good. This is going to alter the entire future of the region. This is going to bring about prosperity in the region. This is going to significantly change the manner in which we connect these areas. Everything is fine. But all the countries have to ensure that this project actually sees the light of the day. It does not remain only on paper. And here the indication is to the similar projects, for example, the North-South corridor and the establishment of and the development of Chabahar port and utilizing it for the access to Central Asian nations. All of that have moved at an extraordinarily slow pace. So the economic realization of the benefits is always lagging. So that is again another major challenge, and that is the execution and implementation of it. It is that part where China has gained a kind of a proficiency, and that is why China is able to exploit the other economies who are vulnerable, because they are able to implement and execute their projects in the timely manner. That is something that countries like India need to learn about. Okay? Now, moving on to the second article. The second article is what is driving the Global Biofuel Alliance. Now, again, on the sidelines of the G20 presidency, now at that point of time, another alliance was launched, and that is the Global Biofuel Alliance. Now, till now, you have 19 countries who have indicated their interest to becoming a member or have become a member of this particular alliance. And you have 12 international organizations as well, UNIDO, World Bank, etc., who have also become a partner of this particular alliance. So here, what is relevant for your prelims? In all these areas, even for the corridor part, even in this part, the members and the member nations, that is going to be relevant for your prelims preparation. So this is going to be relevant for your prelims. That is, you have 3 founding members out of the total 19 countries which have agreed to become a member of this particular alliance. You have 3 founding members, that is India, the US and Brazil. Together, it is these countries which account for 85% of the global biofuel production. 85%, that is humongous. Now, there are other supporting countries amongst the G20 fora themselves. So that is Argentina, Canada, Italy, and South Africa. These are also the supporting members. Now, there are supporting members from the G20 invitees who were invited by India to take part in the G20 summit. That is Bangladesh, Singapore, Mauritius, and UAE. They have also indicated the willingness to join this alliance. Then, non-G20 nations, they have also become members. So you have Iceland, Kenya, Guyana, Paraguay, Seychelles, Sri Lanka, Uganda, and Finland. So these are in total the 19 countries till now who have become the member. Now, here generally in prelims, what is relevant for you to learn or memorize is the founding members. That is where questions can be framed, that if India is a founding member or not. So if you are aware of that fact, that is good to go. Now, let us analyze this particular article in slightly greater detail. When we talk about biofuels, what do we mean exactly by the term biofuel? So biofuel, as per the International Energy Agency, here it talks about the liquid fuels derived from biomass and used as an alternative to fossil fuel based liquid transportation fuels such as gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel. So this is a kind of a liquid fuel which is an alternative to fossil fuel produced from biomass, produced from biological mechanism. Now, even this biofuel has got various different types depending upon how they are produced. Now you have first generation, second generation, third generation, fourth generation, and these are the classification of biofuels. But what you need to be aware of in chief, because of the discussion which has happened in this alliance meeting, is the first generation and the second generation biofuel. The first generation of biofuel is produced by utilizing various different crops and residues such as sugarcane, corn, soybean, etc. Now, these are the various different crops from which biofuel is manufactured, from which the biofuel is made. Now, it is here that India also ends up manufacturing significant amount of biofuel from these crop and crop residues as well. But that is where the possibilities arise for increase of farm income and so on. Now the second generation biofuel, which is thought to be much more sustainable, and the second generation biofuel, which is thought to be much more long lasting, that is produced from agricultural waste, used cooking oil, processed animal residues such as animal fats, etc. So such as animal fats here. Okay. So it is the second generation biofuel which is thought to be, or which is deemed to be, much more sustainable. Why is that? Because as the global population is increasing, and due to climate change factor and the reality of climate change as well, now food security is one of the major concerns across the globe. And ensuring adequate amount of food supply across the globe becomes very, very important. So that is why when we talk about the first generation biofuel, it can in a way damage food security. So that is why the countries involved, in fact, they have talked about the stress to be laid on the second generation biofuel. This will not only reduce the amount of waste that you simply dispose of into the outside environment, but it will also accrue some amount of economic benefit associated with it. So that is why the second generation biofuel has been termed to be much more sustainable, and it is this one which will be stressed upon in development in this alliance forum. So this is sustainable. Okay. Now here you also have by the way, the third and the fourth generation biofuel. Third generation biofuel talks about production of biofuel from the microorganisms such as algae, and there also food security won't be hampered. The fourth generation biofuel talks about the production of biofuel from genetically modified microorganisms, where you don't need the cultivable farmlands, etc., to be disturbed at all. So that is the classification of the generation of biofuels. Now here, what is it and why is it that this alliance is sought after? What is the need for this global biofuel alliance? So one has to understand that in the recent past, and in fact as long as you can remember, when it comes to fossil fuels, the availability, the supply as well as the price has remained shaky at level best. Suddenly there are supply shocks. For example, the recent Russia-Ukraine war significantly increased the price of fossil fuel, and that brought about a kind of an untamed inflation rate across majority of the developing nations of the world. And the developing nations as well as the industrialized nations, as they were still emerging from the setback of the COVID pandemic, immediately after that, suffering from this supply shock has been disastrous. So that is why the biofuel which is sought to be developed will be a kind of a sustained alternative out of that. Then increased carbon emissions. Now here the carbon emissions from fossil fuel, that is increasing because increased amount of fossil fuel are used for transportation purposes, and the amount of greenhouse gases emitted, that needs to be curbed. And when the entire world is actually targeting net zero emissions to be achieved by 2050, 60 or 2070, it is important for us to develop an alternative. Then need for alternative for long haul transport, aviation, etc. Because please understand, there might be development of some alternate fuels such as hydrogen, electric vehicles, etc. But that is still restricted to the smaller vehicles. And those smaller vehicles cannot be used for transportation of goods over longer distances, can they? Now here, when you talk about long haul road transport or the aviation fuel, now aviation fuel recently has also again has experienced a price shock, due to which the airline prices have gone higher up. Now that has brought about a significant dent in the pocket of the airlines and the various different airline industries as well. So if you actually make an alternative where the airlines and the airplanes can actually travel with the help of the biofuel, that will be very significant move in terms of ensuring resilience in global supply chains. Then Alternate modes of energy is still in very much the formative stages. It has still not been established so significantly, and that is still somewhere down the line in future, whereas biofuel, the technology is already available. All you need is implementation. In the case of hydrogen, etc., it is the technology, the cheaper version of the technology, which is still not available. So that is why it is some distance away. But biofuels are available as of now. Now, what it will also end up doing is increase of farm income. In a country like India, where we have more than 50% of the population directly or indirectly related to agricultural sector, farm income is of utmost importance and significance. Now, how do you increase the farm income? You can increase the farm income by various mechanisms, by various methodologies. Either you can increase the supply by some process or the other, or you can end up utilizing the wastes, the residues generated from the farmland. So that is going to be significantly beneficial, especially for the sugarcane farmers. In India, you would be aware that majority of the arrears in the farming sector, they are pending in the sugarcane farming sector. It is the sugar mills who are always in a distressed state when it comes to the financial outlook of them. So that is why it bodes particularly well for the large amount of sugarcane farmers that we have across our country, because utilization of, let's suppose, bagasse, molasses, etc. that you gain from sugarcane, that can be utilized for the generation of second generation biofuel. And when you produce biofuel in large mass, in large quantity, it will also end up creating very valuable jobs in the process. Now, India-specific benefits, that is also something that you need to realize. Now, this is not something associated in the article, but here you have to understand this, that it will, first of all, India being one of the nations which has pushed this forward, India being one of those founding members, it will always end up strengthening India's position globally. India's stature when it comes to seeking alternative fuels, when it comes to combating climate change, those credentials would be strengthened by the establishment of this alliance. Will provide additional opportunities to Indian industries when it comes to export of these biofuels, export of the equipments for the biofuels. So that will provide additional opportunities. It will also help accelerate the existing biofuels programs that Indian government is launching, that Indian government is already implementing. For example, you have the PM-Jeevan Yojana, the Satat Yojana, which is to seek the alternate fuel for the transportation sector. Because again, transportation sector is a significant amount of fuel guzzler. And please understand, a country like India, where almost 85% of the fossil fuel requirements, more than that in fact, are met through imports. For a country like India, it is a boon to develop, and it is going to be significantly beneficial to develop an alternate fuel mechanism. It will also help us save the foreign exchange. So, helps save vital foreign exchange. Okay, it will provide a kind of import substitution as well. Now, the future is very bright in this area. If you take an analysis, the global ethanol market was valued at $99 billion in 2022 and is predicted to surpass $162 billion by 2032. So if you have Indian companies who are already in this sector, who are already manufacturing this, they will benefit quite substantially. If you take a look at what the future holds or what the future looks like. Now, these countries, the founding members, they are the leading producers of these biofuels across the entirety of the world. So United States, Brazil and India, they contribute 85% of the share in production and about 81% in consumption of ethanol. It is in line with meeting the net zero targets as well, and 2/3 of the global demand is going to arise from countries like India, Indonesia and Brazil going ahead into the future. And this is the fuel for the immediate future, if not for the long-term future. So that is why India also needs to be working for increasing the amount of efficiency for the biofuel production and making it a part of the global supply chain again. Okay, so that is the aspect of the Global Biofuel Alliance that one needs to be aware of. Now, after that, moving to the third article of the day, and that is Winds of Change in Global Governance. Now, again, this has been written in the context of the G20 presidentship that India had held now, and India is still holding, and India had held the very successful G20 meeting recently. Now, at that point of time, it signified the emergence of the global south, and India ensuring the step for the participation of African Union and providing and granting the membership of G20 to the African Union under its presidency again signifies the rise of the global south. And this is a rise which has been happening for some time. But before getting into the nitty-gritties of it, what do we mean by global south? Global south is a reference that you would have come across time and time again. But what is this global south about? So the entire discussion about the global south, that discussion started in the 1960s itself. And for the first time, it was termed by Carl Oglesby. A US scholar, Carl Oglesby, for the first time in 1969, he used the term Global South in order to indicate that there is an increased amount of exploitation happening at the hands of the global north when it comes to the countries who are present in the global south. So that is what was indicated by Carl Oglesby. Now, eventually in the 80s, that demarcation of the global south was done by what was referred to as a curve that is known as the Brandt line. So that Brandt line is again relevant for your prelims perspective. The Brandt line. Okay? This is going to be relevant for your prelims perspective. What is the Brandt line? So the Brandt line overall, it seeks to divide the global north and the global south. So when we talk about the global north and south here, observe it is a distinguishing factor between the developed nations and the less developed nations, even though this line is not very particularly encompassing and not particularly representative, because of the fact that when you consider Australia and New Zealand, they form a part of the developed or the industrialized nations. They are not a part of the so-called less developed nations or the developing nations out there. So that is why you have this particular line which has got some discrepancies, but this is the line which seeks to divide the countries in terms of the developmental parameters. Now, why is it that there is a need for the emergence of global south? Why does the global south has finally felt the need to exert its weight behind all the various narratives when it comes to multilateral organizations, when it comes to developmental processes? First of all, the global south, or all these developing nations of the world, they represent around 3/4 of the overall global population, and that is quite significant. You cannot carry out any kind of developmental mechanism or any kind of developmental process unless and until you cater to the significant amount of almost more than 75% of the global population. It is their requirement, it is their functionality, their demands which needs to be understood, which needs to be catered to. Now, it has impacted the most. The entirety of the global south has been impacted due to supply chain disruptions. At the time of the COVID pandemic as well, while the industrialized nations could always bring about some or the other kind of alternatives, it was the developing nations which could not fit the bill. Okay, the developing nations which could not basically seek an alternative. Again, during the Russia-Ukraine war, it was the global south which did suffer because of the lack of availability of food, fuel, and so on. Then it is the global south which has also been impacted the most due to climate change. And climate change has impacted them quite significantly, be it considering the floods, the increased amount of cyclones. Now the developed nations or the industrialized nations, they still have some amount of leeway, some amount of disaster and relief operations that they can launch. But it is the developing nations who do suffer. And there is also a historical reason in the sense that whenever you have such meetings at international forum, at United Nations, etc., always what is cited here is the fact that for almost more than 100 years and more, there has been exploitation of the global south which is happening at the hands of the developed nations which are termed as global north. So that is why finally the members of the global south, they see this as the opportune time to drive the narrative. And only when the global south is powerful or active enough can they shape the narrative in the sense where true form of multilateralism will be indicated. Otherwise, the power politics in terms of who has got the greater amount of influence across the world, that is always played amongst the members of the global north or the industrialized nations, and it is the developing nations which always suffer from a significant amount of setback. Now, here, there have been previous attempts as well, and there have been ongoing attempts as well to consolidate the voice of the global south, to bring them together on the negotiating table, because the economically poorer nations, always they are sidelined at major negotiations to think about that what is the contribution that they can bring to the table. But when all the members of the global south, they come together, that is when their negotiating power increases. And one of these important groupings is the G77 grouping. As of now, who holds the presidentship for the G77 grouping? It is Cuba, and the Cuban head of state who holds the presidentship of G77. So this G77 is one of the largest international groupings which was founded in June 15, 1964 by the 77 developing nations. Now China has also been a part of this, but China is not considered to be part of the developing world or the global south now because the per capita income has significantly increased. So that is why oftentimes the grouping is also referred to as G77 plus China. That is what the grouping is sought to be. Now, they were the original signatories of the joint declaration of the 77 countries, and that happened in the first session of United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in Geneva. This fact again becomes relevant for your prelims, because it can always be a question which can be framed that G77 was formed when or where it was formed. So you can have a statement like question framed from there. So you have to be aware of these particular facts. Now the aim of the G77 grouping is what? To bring about a greater cooperation and coordination amongst the global south when it comes to very important matters of discussion. For example, let's suppose when we talk about the discussion of matters on, let's suppose, climate change, let's suppose on the loss and damage fund which has been initiated during the conference of parties on climate change in Egypt last year. So in all of that, a south-south coordination is always welcome. So that is an aim, and also to increase their negotiating power, as we have already discussed. There is another organization which the United Nations had set up immediately when the discussion had started in the late 60s and the early 70s. It was in 1974 when the United Nations General Assembly had established another organization, that is UNOSSC, that is United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation. Now this was again to improve the amount of coordination which is required in order to achieve some tangible benefits. Now, which cooperation are we talking about? We are talking about the cooperation between the industrial nations of the world, cooperation between the developing nations of the world, and also the cooperation in existence between the multilateral organizations. So this cooperation is sought to be improved and increased. So that is the basic purpose, and it is only then when, as we have reiterated, that true form of multilateralism can be achieved, keeping people's interest at the forefront, keeping the people's interest in mind rather than caring for the power politics. Okay? Now, let us move to certain articles relevant for your prelims perspective. So, you have now the establishment or the device of the AI-based camera systems which are being implemented in the region of Madhya Pradesh, and various different experimental phases have been carried out in Madhya Pradesh to indicate the efficacy of this. So these cameras, they basically have the AI based technology which can identify the poachers, right? The hunters and the poachers in a particular region can be identified with this particular camera setup. So that is why this is relevant for your examination in prelims. So the system is referred to as the trail guard. AI based camera setup. Now, here what kind of question can be framed? As simple as what is that trail guard AI based camera setup? There also you will get the relevant result or the relevant answer out of that. Okay. Now, again, over 75% of European bumblebee species are threatened. Now, this has been happening because of increased impact of climate change, due to which their habitat is reducing. The areas where they naturally are to be found, where they naturally live, that area is shrinking. So that is why, and please understand, the bumblebee population is relevant for multiple different perspectives. First of all, these belonging to the insect species, now they are very important for the pollination in terms of the flowers, and when it comes to reproductive mechanism in the plant species. Now, the decline in the population of these bumblebees can in a way impact the diversity or the genetic diversity and also the overall species diversity in the plant community or the floral community. So, the plant-based biodiversity will be impacted significantly because of this. Okay, that is one which will be impacted, because by the process of pollination, that is how they are able to move from one flower to another and ensure the reproduction of it. So if this population reduces, plants will be impacted. But secondly, this also follows the trend of the global decline in the population of forests, in the population of insects rather. Across the globe, population of insects have indicated a decline, a general decline. And what this has done is, it has threatened the bird population as well. Because the birds, they particularly rely upon the presence of these insects in large quantities to feed their young ones as well. So again, the decline in population of the bumblebee will also impact the bird population. Okay, so both of them are relevant, and it is indeed a matter of concern, indeed a matter of growing concern for us to understand how to bring that under control. Because now in majority of the areas in Central Europe, in Western Europe as well, the habitats are shrinking obviously because of population pressure, urbanization, and also the warming climate. So many of them are moving towards the Scandinavian regions, that is the Northern European regions. And there also, eventually there will be significant amount of climate change happening there as well. So there will be impact caused in that area as well. Now, moving on to the next article, evasive nutritional support for TB patients. Now, this article talks about the fact about the findings that how availability, or in fact lack of availability of nutrition for the TB patients is simply exaggerating the problem of tuberculosis which is faced. Now, tuberculosis is a disease which is spread by a bacterium that belongs to the category of Mycobacterium. Mycobacterium and that entire genus that is responsible for the spread of diseases like TB, for the spread of diseases like even leprosy. So that is where Mycobacterium is responsible for this disease. But coming to the tuberculosis problem, India has got a significant large burden of tuberculosis patients in the entirety of the world. Now, many of these tuberculosis patients, they suffer quite significantly due to lack of nutritional support. And that has been indicated in various different areas, and the various different studies carried out in different states have further shown that the nutritional problem is quite significant. Now, the government schemes associated with it, that is something that you need to extract. Now, even though not mentioned in this particular article, but what you can extract from the prelims perspective is the fact of Nikshay Poshan Yojana. Now, when we talk about Nikshay Poshan Yojana, it was launched in 2018 by the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare, and it aims to support the TB patient by providing a direct benefit transfer of rupees 500 for the TB patients so that they get the nutritional support, so that they are given that kind of support financially. Many of the times they suffer significantly from the financial perspective, where they don't get any availability of food resources. So this 500 rupees sum is provided to ensure that kind of financial support. Now, since its inception, close to around 1500 crore has been paid. Now, while this goes a long way in giving a nutritional support, the government has also come up with what is referred to as the Nikshay Mitra scheme. Now, the Nikshay Mitras, who can be individuals, who can be corporates, who can be the NGOs, who can be the member of parliaments, anyone, now they can choose to provide or adopt, let's suppose, any healthcare center. They can provide an additional assistive support in terms of the vocational training, in terms of ensuring that the nutrition is measured and to be provided, diagnostic measurements. So that is to bring about a further relief, a kind of a hand-holding process in the entire journey as the patient tries to navigate through the problem of TB. Now, coming to the last article, and that is about songbirds. So the recent scientific studies and researchers have indicated that the ability, now what are these songbirds? Songbirds are of multiple varieties, of multiple different functionalities. Now these songbirds, their ability to hear a sound, mimic that sound and reproduce that sound. Now that gives us an idea about the brain size of these songbirds as well, because not all the songbirds will have the same ability to reproduce the sound that they hear. So that is why this has been a landmark study which has been carried out, and the research which has indicated that just by hearing the kind of sounds that they mimic, you will be able to hear or understand the evolution mechanism of these songbirds as well. Okay? Now, that brings us to the questions which can be framed from this particular area, the subjective questions. So the first question is, what is the Global Biofuel Alliance? Discuss its importance for developing nations like India. This is a 10 marker of 150 worded answer which is required. So here in the introduction, just mention what do we mean by the Global Biofuel Alliance. So this was established, or this was formed during the G20 presidency of India, where you had the founding members talk about India, US and Brazil. That will be your introduction. After that, in the body, talk about, first of all, what do you mean by biofuel? You talk about the importance of the biofuel, and also how is it that the developing nations are going to benefit out of it. Then discuss the role of the Global South in steering the principles of multilateralism. This is 15 marks, 250 words. So in this case, the introduction needs to talk about what do you mean by Global South. Try to indicate a rough map of the world. Try to indicate the Brandt line. Again, I will reiterate, Brandt line is going to be very relevant in the coming examination next year, given the importance associated with it in various different multilateral organizations. So here, talk about that Brandt line and the Global South in the introduction. Then after that, talk about the various requirements. Why is it that the Global South requires to or needs to exert its role and its presence in global narrative setting? And all the various things that we have discussed, you can highlight that and start by driving the fact that around 75% of the global population resides in the Global South. So their needs and demands, they become very important. And talk about multilateralism as well. That multilateralism is carried out for what primary purpose? In order to provide some sort of benefit out there. So benefit for whom? For the people associated. So that is again something that you can highlight. Eventually you can conclude your answer by saying that moving ahead into the future, it is the people's perspective which needs to be taken care of, and that is where the Global South, the G77, comes into role. So that is how you can finish your answer. That will be all from my side here today. Till we meet again, Do take care of yourself. In case you have liked the content of the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share and the subscribe button. And also, again, a gentle reminder, do take up the multiple choice questions from this analysis to assess your level of understanding. That will be all. Thank you and goodbye.